Imagine you're an artist, and 1,500 of your paintings, which you created over 15 years, have been turned into doormats and aprons for slaughtering cattle by some soldiers. What should you do if critics advise you to get psychiatric help because trees aren't supposed to be purple? I'm Nina Ninashev, and today we're going to talk about an artist without whom Impressionism most likely wouldn't have happened. Camille Pissarro, one of the 7 great Impressionists. It's going to be interesting. Let's go! If you think that all French Impressionists are Parisians, I'm about to surprise you. The real name of our hero is Camille Jacob Pissarro, and he was born on July 10, 1830, thousands of kilometers away from France, on the tiny tropical island of Saint Thomas in the Caribbean Sea. I'll explain the unique and complicated family system little Camille was in. This is important. His paternal ancestors were Marranos, as Portuguese Jews from the city of Braganza were called, who were forcibly converted to Christianity during the Inquisition. As we know, you can't force genuine faith, so the family lived in constant duality. In public, they observed Christian rituals, but at home, they kept Jewish traditions. Camille's father, Frederick, came to St. Thomas in 1824 for a rather mundane personal reason. His uncle died. They needed to help the widow, Rochelle Monsana Pamier, with running the trading shop. And, as usual, the help soon extended beyond just the shop. The nephew and his aunt fell in love and Rochelle became pregnant. The community strongly condemned the aunt and her nephew's scandalous union. So Pissarro, who grew up amid the clash, one could even say the hypocrisy and injustice of two cultures, would eventually become a convinced atheist and even an anarchist. This will be important for us. At the age of 12, the boy was sent across the Atlantic to Paris to study at a commercial college. It was there that Pissarro first picked up a pencil and fell in love with drawing. But after finishing his studies, 17-year-old Camille returns to St. Thomas, and his father puts him behind the counter in the family shop. For 5 long years, Pissarro counts goods, does the bookkeeping, and earns a very decent income, much to the delight of his father, who is satisfied to see that there is someone to inherit the family business. But Camille hates office work, and in his free time, he secretly runs to the port and passionately sketches ships, sailors, and the port bustle. And then he has an encounter that will change his life. In 1850, the Danish landscape painter Prince Melby arrives at the port of St. Thomas. He is only a couple of years older than Pissarro, but already a real artist, traveling around South America. Melby, while walking through the port, saw a young man making sketches and asked if he could take a look at his sketchbook. What he saw impressed him. "Camille, are you out of your mind?" said Melby, looking at the drawings of the dock workers. "Forget the shop, forget the bookkeeping. You have tremendous talent. I'm going to Venezuela to paint nature. Drop everything and come with me." Pissarro understood that if he went to his father, he would simply lock him up. So the 20-year-old young man writes a short note saying that he's leaving the office for painting, leaves it on his desk, and at night secretly boards a ship with his new friend aboard a ship called Dr. Ratasa. His father was furious and cut off his son's financial support, expecting him to return and admit his mistake. But the friends spent 5 whole years traveling around Venezuela, where Camille made hundreds of sketches from life. Southern nature, colorful street scenes, ordinary people. It was here that he first tried his hand as an artist. But after 5 years of such a free life and a beggar's existence, the now 25-year-old Pissarro finally returns home. His father, realizing that his stubborn son could not be changed, gives in and lets him go to Paris, even granting him a small monthly allowance so that he can study only with real professionals. And Pissarro leaves for Paris again. Here's where we should explain how Paris's art system was organized at that time, the world art capital that attracted artists globally. The French art scene of the 19th century was a totalitarian monopoly. All power belonged to the Academy of Fine Arts, which organized an annual exhibition and sale of paintings by all artists, the Paris Salon, at the end of which the best artists are awarded a medal. The only way for an artist to get clients, sell a painting, and simply not starve to death is to pass through the filter of the Paris Salon and receive the approval of the academicians. How did the Salon system work? The artists brought their canvases to a jury of academicians. If the canvas was painted according to the strict rules of academicism, dark background, a historical or mythological subject, smooth brushwork so that not even a trace of the brush was visible, it would be accepted.
If the jury rejected the painting, a shameful stamp with an R for rejected would be placed on the back of it. After that, it becomes almost impossible to sell the painting for a decent price, and clients will start to avoid the artist himself.
That's why artists were terrified of this black mark and didn't dare to experiment at all. Pissarro honestly tried to fit into the system and enrolled in the School of Fine Arts. But the academic method quickly started to stifle him. At the school, they made students copy plaster casts for years and work in a dark studio according to rules invented 200 years ago. Pissarro was already accustomed to the Caribbean sun and to thinking and creating freely. So he finds an alternative, a private studio. The most famous at the time was the Académie Suisse, which almost all the stars of painting went through. It's worth explaining who Suisse was. This man was not an artist, and he had nothing to do with art theory. In his youth, he worked as a professional model. He got rich, rented a space, and started leasing it to aspiring painters for a symbolic fee. For a couple of francs, artists could come there and paint a live model without any lectures or supervision from professors, exchange opinions with colleagues, argue, and learn from each other's experience. It was at the Swiss Academy that 29-year-old Pissarro met the still young men Claude Monet and Paul Cézanne. I have videos on both topics on my channel. Check them out. Links are in the description. Camille was older than them. He already had experience traveling, and by nature he was calm, steady, and thoughtful. And he naturally becomes the older mentor figure for this group, which is still unknown to anyone. At the same time, Pissarro is seeking out living teachers. He comes to the landscape painter Camille Pissarro, an absolute living classic of French landscape painting and a recognized master. At the 1855 World's Fair in Paris, Emperor Napoleon III himself purchased one of his paintings. I will definitely make a video about him, so subscribe so you don't miss it. Pissarro came to see the 60-year-old Corot. The master, although he didn't take on students, after seeing Pissarro's work, warmly welcomed the newcomer from the Caribbean islands and allowed him to work in his workshop. The main advice that Corot gave to the young Pissarro shaped the rest of his life. Paint what you see and feel yourself. The main thing is a first impression and working outdoors, not within academic walls. In 1859, 28-year-old Pissarro submitted his work to the official Paris Salon for the first time in his life. And in order to get accepted, he resorts to a trick. He submits the painting to the Salon and signs in the catalogue as a student of Antoine Melby, the brother of his friend Fritz, the very one who took him to Venezuela. And the jury accepts his work. The painting was hung in a dark corner under the ceiling, unnoticed by others, but for Pissarro, it was a significant breakthrough and seemed like the beginning. But in that same year, 1859, Pissarro's parents moved to Paris. And along with them comes his mother's maid, a simple Catholic peasant woman from Burgundy named Durand-Ruel. And Camille, who had already disappointed his father with his rebelliousness, falls in love with the maid of his own household. Pissarro's father, who, as you remember, had himself once gone through rejection by the community because of an unlawful marriage, reacted extremely harshly. He categorically refused to acknowledge his son's relationship with an uneducated maid and gave him an ultimatum: my money or this peasant girl. What do you think Camille will choose? That's right, the same thing his father once chose: love. His father instantly cuts off his financial support, and Camille ends up on the street without a penny to his name. In 1863, their firstborn son Lucien is born. But the unknown landscape painter doesn't even have enough money for food. And to survive, the family was forced to move out of expensive Paris to the suburb of Varennes-Saint-Hilaire. There, Julie takes care of all the household chores and starts a vegetable garden to feed her child and husband with potatoes and cabbage. Officially, they will only get married 7 years later, in 1870, but for now, they live on the brink of absolute poverty. But despite their dire existence, and I would even say thanks to it, it is during this period that Pissarro's unique style is formed. He lives in a small village, he doesn't have money for travel, and he can barely afford paint. And the only thing left for him is to paint what he sees around him. Rural landscapes of picturesque provincial France. While Delacroix and Renoir travel to Algeria for bright colors, and Gauguin will later escape to Tahiti, Pissarro gradually falls in love with the modest, unassuming nature of northern France.
Look at the painting Varenne Saint-Hilaire.
Look at this composition. No pomp, no contrived academic beauty, just an ordinary field. Women are gathering grass, an endless, soft sky.
Notice that the figures of the people are not detailed like in academic portraits. Their faces are often not depicted at all. The brushstroke is quite large and visible, whereas academicism required the brushstroke to be as invisible as possible. Pissarro is not interested in small, meticulous details. He is fascinated by the composition itself, its mood, which he tried to convey through colors. For Pissarro, a person in a painting is part of nature, part of the overall atmosphere of color and air, not the scene's focus. In 1863, the Salon jury became completely ruthless and rejected the canvases of as many as 3,000 artists. Such a scandal broke out that it lasted until the evening. Emperor Napoleon III was forced to establish the so-called Salon of the Rejected, an alternative exhibition where unrecognized rebels were able to show their works for the first time. The Paris Salon also rejected Pissarro that year, and he exhibited at the Salon of the Rejected, together with Edouard Manet. The Salon was extremely popular with the public, but people went there as if to a circus show, to laugh and point fingers at the paintings of those they considered untalented. With their huge and careless brushstrokes and people's heads without faces, not a single painting by Pissarro was sold, but he never even considered returning to academic painting. Now let's move to Paris in the 1860s to Batignolles Street, to the Café Gerbois, and find out how Edouard Manet ended up at the exhibition next to Pissarro. Don't confuse him with Claude Monet. I have a video about Edouard Manet on my channel. Check it out, it's really interesting. So, Paris, Café Gerbois. Today, you'll only find tourists here. Back then, it was the noisiest, smokiest, and extremely dangerous place for academic art, where ideas were born that would soon destroy academicism, with its fierce and unbearably boring rules. On Fridays, the whole Batignolles gang gathers here, around the big table. Edouard Manet, the main dandy and informal leader, the feisty Edgar Degas, the young and passionate Claude Monet, and his quiet friend, Auguste Renoir. All of them, except for Edouard Manet, are around 20 to 25 years old. They are young, passionate, and completely fed up with the conservatism of the academy. They passionately discuss the ideas behind this new kind of painting, which they developed together. Soon, this concentration of ideas will turn into what we today call Impressionism. And among this lively young group sits a 35-year-old man with a long, thick beard, Camille Pissarro, who regularly made an hour-long journey from his backwater once a week to take part in the weekly meetings with his companions. Do you know who he was in this group? He was the main peacemaker and psychological anchor. The hot-tempered Degas could get into an argument with Manet in half a minute. Manet tended to go to extremes, but Pissarro, thanks to his calmness and composure, could diffuse any conflict. However, out of all of them, he was probably the most persistent and passionate fan of the new approach to painting. Pissarro was older than most of the rebels. He was 2 years older than Manet, 4 than Degas, 9 than Cézanne, and, luckily, 10 years older than Monet. Even the most hot-headed ones listened to his opinion. It was Pissarro who brought the geeky and reserved Paul Cézanne, whom he met at the Académie Suisse, as well as Armand Guillaumin, to the Café Gerbois. At the tables of Gerbois, there were heated discussions that the jury of the official salon would never accept their painting. It was there that Pissarro, Manet, and Degas came up with the idea to create an independent, cooperative community and organize their own exhibition. That's how Impressionism was born in 1874. Let me briefly explain what Impressionism is and how strongly it contrasted with academicism. Academicism had existed unchanged for more than 200 years, ever since Poussin established its rules. Mystical or heroic paintings, with a person at the center, restrained drama, all the details meticulously rendered to create a sense of indistinguishability from reality. But all the subjects had already been painted 100 times, all the techniques had been tried, and painting itself was suffocating from conservatism under the strict supervision of the Academy of Arts, without the slightest chance for experimentation. And then a group of young artists appeared, aided by the technological revolution, which first brought about chemical paints, brighter, cheaper, and more durable, and then the truly revolutionary invention of the paint tube. Before that, paints were mixed right in the studio, they dried quickly, and it was extremely difficult to transport them. But a simple paint tube turned the world of artists upside down. A simple screw cap, no matter how trivial it may seem to us now, allowed artists to take paints with them outdoors, squeeze them out, close them up, and the chemical paint would last as long as needed. And young artists, not constrained by academicism, rushed outside into the open air to paint not from memory, but from life. New paints, new bright colors, daylight, and changing weather required much faster painting, and the style emerged where artists didn't paint every detail, but instead, with just a few precise strokes, created a kind of mosaic of brush strokes. Here, paints were mixed directly on the canvas instead of the palette, revealing new possibilities. Young artists began to perfect the skill of applying as few precise, skillful brushstrokes as possible, while still capturing the scene before their eyes, without losing either the mood or the authenticity of the landscape. This was an approach that was diametrically opposed to classicism. I would even say hostile to it. There is a common opinion that Impressionists were carefree dilettantes who simply couldn't draw details, so they painted quickly, carelessly, and at random. In reality, of course, they knew academic training. It was just boring to them. They searched for and absorbed everything new, soon discovering that all shadows in nature are not black, that any object or shadow is always colored by the color of the light falling on it, whether evening light, morning light, or lamplight, as well as by the color reflected from nearby objects. They called this effect reflections and declared black shadows to be an archaic relic of blind academism, locked away in studios under the light of oil lamps. And Pissarro, of course, was one of the most passionate followers of these new ideas. You will see this soon. Let's also explain how the art market worked then. This matters. As you already know, selling a painting without a salon was almost impossible. But by the mid-1860s, a new figure appeared on the market, a new player that hadn't existed before, the independent art dealer. Essentially, a modern-type art manager who takes on the role of the salon, an investor who seeks out promising talents and buys their paintings for resale, taking on all the risks of misjudgment. The main one among them was Paul Durand-Ruel. Durand-Ruel understood earlier than anyone else what the officials from the academy did not. The future belonged to independent artists. He started buying paintings from impoverished rebels, including Pissarro. He bought them for next to nothing, of course, but for Camille's family, since no one was buying his paintings at all, it was the only chance not to starve to death. The same was true for Monet and Renoir. All of them lived for a whole 30 years on the risky investments of Durand-Ruel, who almost went bankrupt. But it was these 30 years that allowed new ideas to survive. And in 1864, Pissarro painted the picture The Road. The motif of the road would actually become a recurring theme throughout all of his work. You will see this. Note how the country road recedes into the depth of the canvas. Here, there is no black paint used for the shadows at all. Everything is painted with natural, soft, somewhat gloomy tones, in which he doesn't try to create halftones. The shadows create the composition. In 1865, Pissarro and Julie had their second child, a daughter named Jean. They moved to Paris, hoping to live there on the small amount of money he received from Durand-Ruel. But Paris was too expensive for them, so they moved to Pontoise that year. Julie would occasionally rebel. She would shout, cry, and demand that Camille give up painting and go work as a house painter or a shopkeeper, just to earn at least some money. And Pissarro would sigh, hug her, and then go back to his easel. But see what he painted during those tough years. Let's view the painting Hermitage at Pontoise. Look at this canvas. No grand castles, no lofty fantasies, just an ordinary hill. Modest two-story houses, a winding country road, and people walking. But pay attention to the light. Look at how Pissarro conveys the sun-filled air. The greenery is lush, the shadows are warm and ochre. This is absolute poetry of everyday life, conveyed through new pictorial means, and that was his main experiment. I always say that Impressionism needs to be seen in person. You need to see how the brush strokes are applied and how their direction and size create additional texture on the painting, guiding our gaze along the lines intended by the artist, and from a distance merging into a complete picture, which, up close, breaks down into separate patches of color. And now, let's immediately compare Hermitage at Pontoise with another painting of his from the same year, street in Pontoise. Do you feel the difference? The subject is the same, a city street, but it's a cloudy day. Look at how the entire palette changes. The sky is covered with clouds, and the wet cobblestones reflect the gray light. The green of the leaves and the red roof tiles lose their brightness as they are enveloped in a damp, grayish haze. An academic artist would have painted all this with black and brown paints in the studio, painting each leaf from memory. Pissarro, on the other hand, stood outside with his canvas and umbrella in the drizzling rain, capturing the most precise color nuances, which are simply impossible to remember and convey in the studio.
3 years later, in 1870, Pissarro moved to Louveciennes, where he created painting after painting. Take a look at another work, The Mail Coach at Louveciennes.
Autumn, a city washed by rain, a carriage rustling its wheels along the wet road, peace and harmony in the landscape. And the same brush strokes as always. Brush strokes, the same play with colorful mosaics and the construction of reality, transferred as it is directly onto the canvas, sometimes even without a preliminary sketch. Pissarro is already 40 years old, and still no one recognizes him, except for his fellow unrecognized colleagues and Durand-Ruel. That's why he keeps painting in obscurity, and in his house in Louveciennes, works from the last 15 years of continuous labor accumulate. July 1870 arrives, and neither Camille nor Julie knows yet that in just a couple of months, the Franco-Prussian War will break out, and their whole life, along with these paintings, will be destroyed and trampled into the dirt. So, July 1870, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out unexpectedly. France attacks Prussia, but events unfold catastrophically and the fighting quickly spreads to France itself. The French army suffers defeat after defeat, and the Prussian troops begin to rapidly advance on Paris. Louveciennes ends up right on the path of the enemy army. Camille has pregnant Julie and 2 small children with him. Staying is out of the question. He has to save his family. In a terrible rush, they gather the most essential things and abandon their home. In his studio, Pissarro leaves neatly stacked canvases, almost his entire archive from 15 years of work, about 1,500 paintings and sketches. Of course, back then in 1870, these paintings were not considered masterpieces at all. For the public and art dealers, Pissarro was simply an unrecognized artist whose works hardly sold at all. But for Camille himself, it was a tragedy of 15 years of creative searching. The family first fled to the west of France, to Brittany, to Pissarro's friend, the artist Ludovic Piette. And when it becomes clear that the war is dragging on, Camille decides to go even further, to England. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers occupy the abandoned house of the artist and set up quarters there. A regimental slaughterhouse was set up near the house. There, they had to butcher livestock and navigate the muddy autumn yard. And then they find hundreds of dense, well-primed canvases by Pissarro and decide that luck itself has fallen into their hands. But not in terms of enriching themselves with real paintings. Just because these canvases were perfect for cutting out aprons for slaughtering livestock, and they could also be laid on the path to keep their boots clean from the mud. That's exactly what they did. If you, the descendants of those soldiers, learned their names today and figured out what kind of money they were trampling under their boots, they would have had a heart attack for sure. For example, in 2014, the painting Boulevard Montmartre Spring Morning by Camille Pissarro, painted in 1897, was sold for $32 million. And there were 1,500 such paintings there. With proper handling, the descendants of these soldiers would have been provided with a comfortable life for hundreds of generations, but they simply walked on them so as not to get their feet dirty in mud and blood. When Pissarro returns after the war, fewer than 40 of his 1,500 works will remain. 15 years of work were simply trampled into the mud. London did not welcome Pissarro very warmly. A foreign language, a foreign country, refugee status, no buyers, gloomy weather, and a constant lack of money. From a letter by Pissarro to the critic Théodore Duret. Only abroad do you feel how great and beautiful France is. Here everything is different. You encounter only indifference, contempt, and rudeness. The artists here are envious and do not trust each other. There is no art here. Everything is a commodity. But there were also advantages. In London, Pissarro meets with Claude Monet, who also fled from the war. They spend a lot of time together and visit museums. At the National Gallery, they encounter and study in detail the works of English masters John Constable and the great William Turner for the first time, perhaps the most renowned British artist of all time. Be sure to watch the video about him. I'll leave the link in the description. Turner painted seascapes. He was a kind of revolutionary in painting. He invented a new painting technique, applying thick paints to the canvas and smearing them with his hands and rugs, creating dynamic swirls as if dissolving objects in the devouring elements. This didn't even remotely resemble academicism. On the contrary, it contradicted it. However, by that time, Turner himself was already a recognized master in Britain, even though he had died 20 years before the events described. Turner's style was a true forerunner of Impressionism, proving that light and color are more important than the subject itself. For artists, it was like meeting someone who had glimpsed into the future and already succeeded where the French Academy wouldn't let them breathe. In London, the inspired friends once again crossed paths with Paul Durand-Ruel. It was in London that Durand-Ruel opened his first independent gallery and resumed regularly buying their landscapes, which literally saved both exiled artists' families from starvation. Around this time, an important book by the owner of a tapestry manufactory, Jean Chevreul, is published and translated into French. While observing the process of making tapestries, he noticed that small, multicolored stitches, when placed next to each other, blend into a third color when viewed from a distance. And he publishes a book in which for the first time he invents the color wheel, where the colors are arranged so that opposite colors create harmonious combinations. Chevreul describes the law of optical mixing, which, when applied to painting, sounds roughly like this. If you put two brush strokes of opposite colors next to each other on the canvas, for example, yellow and violet, then from a distance, they don't blend into a muddy brown, as they would if we mix these two colors on the palette, but instead create the effect of vibrant, living light. And soon, all the artists will literally go crazy over this visual trick, and Pissarro, together with the Impressionists, finally abandons the use of black paint to depict shadows. Take a look at Pissarro's work, The Road, painted during his time in England. Look at this modest scene. An ordinary country road, a snow-covered street, a couple of figures, and bare tree branches. Pay attention to how the road itself is painted. It's not just painted brown, as the academicians would have done. It reflects the sky. The road is painted with pinkish reflections of the evening sunset sky, and this red light in the painting gives a crimson hue to the entire landscape. And that's exactly how we would see this scene if we took a photograph. All the objects would be tinted pink, but in real life, our brain knows that the trees are brown, the houses are white, and it filters out the pinkish hues. That's exactly how artists painted for hundreds of years, until the Impressionists came along with their reflected colors. In 1871, the Franco-Prussian War ends. Pissarro returns to France, to the ruins of Louveciennes. Almost all his earlier works were destroyed, but together with Manet and Durand-Ruel, after returning and realizing from Turner's example that new art could win recognition, they came up with a bold challenge to the academicians, their own. After the war, Pissarro faces a tough situation. The studio in Louveciennes was destroyed. He had his third child, and the official Paris salon continued to reject independent artists with the same cruelty as before. The time has come to put plans for world domination into action. At the end of 1873, they created the so-called Anonymous Cooperative Society of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. The annual membership fee is 60 francs. Degas finds the premises. They rent the former photo studio of the famous Nadar at 35 Boulevard des Capucines. On April 15, 1874, 2 weeks before the opening of the official salon, they opened their first independent exhibition. Monet, Degas, Renoir, Cézanne, Sisley, Pissarro, and Cézanne participate in it with the support of Durand-Ruel. And it is Pissarro who acts as the main administrator and diplomat at this stage. For example, Monet and Degas were absolutely against letting Paul Cézanne into the exhibition. They thought his works were too crude and wild, but Pissarro stood his ground. He believed a more representative group was better and persuaded them to accept Cézanne. However, the exhibition turned out to be a financial disaster. Although as many as 3,500 people visited it in a month, most came there literally as if to a hall of mirrors, an attraction to chuckle at the amateurs. Louis Leroy, a journalist from the newspaper Le Charivari, wrote a famous critical article about the exhibition and, in particular, about Claude Monet's painting Impression Sunrise. In his satirical note, he mockingly calls the whole group Impressionists, mere peddlers of impressions.
implying that they can't paint and are just passing off their immature impressions.
As finished paintings, the word Impressionists was meant as an insult, but the artists adopted it and made it their official brand. Pissarro exhibited 5 of his landscapes. The critics showed a total misunderstanding of his works.
One of the reviewers wrote, "Make Monsieur Pissarro understand that trees are not purple, that the sky is not the color of fresh butter, and that there is no mind capable of perceiving such delusions."
You see, they still couldn't see what you and I now simply take for granted. That our faces under a green lamp will look greenish and the foliage of trees in the sunset will take on crimson tones. Can you imagine how hard it was for the Impressionists to convince all those stubborn people to literally look at the world with new eyes and finally see the colors that our brain hides from us? Back then, it was like being able to see the figure in 3D pictures. Not everyone was capable of that. From 1972 to 1982, the main creative focus and center for Pissarro became Pontoise, a small provincial town to the northwest of Paris, where Paul Cézanne lived at the time, who was still considered a savage from the south back then.
Only Pissarro almost immediately saw his talent. Cézanne would later gratefully say that it was Pissarro who saved him as an artist. Without Cézanne, Cubism and Fauvism wouldn't exist.
Pissarro settled in a house not far from Cézanne, and for 2 years, the two soon-to-be great artists worked side by side, enriching each other with their knowledge. I should also note here that Pissarro's trip to England was an almost unattainable luxury at the time.
Not many people could afford it, so the knowledge he brought back was truly unique.
There was no internet or color printing back then. To see Turner's paintings in all their glory, you had to actually travel there and see them in person. Pissarro teaches Cézanne to abandon heavy, dull academic shadows, to vary his brushwork, and to see the light in nature. 30 years later, already recognized as a master, Cézanne would write, "All Cézanne, student of Pissarro." Despite the public and academic strong rejection of his paintings, Pissarro was held in great respect within professional circles, due to his character, experience, age, and talent. And soon, many young artists came to him in Pontoise to learn the craft. Pissarro never claimed to be a teacher or accepted money from them. He offered a simple format. Come, stand next to me, set up your easel, and paint the same thing I do. We'll argue and experiment. For beginner artists like the young Paul Gauguin, who came to him a little later, this was the best school in the world. An interesting video about Gauguin is coming soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Let's take a look at what Pissarro painted in Pontoise and why it irritated academic critics so much. Take a look at the painting Hoarfrost. Perhaps Pissarro's most famous painting, because it was the one he showed at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1974. Look at the subject. A plowed field covered with morning hoarfrost. A peasant with a basket trudging along a country road. We look at it and don't see anything subversive in this painting. And now, what I told you earlier will come in handy. So why was the public outraged? Well, first of all, an academic landscape was supposed to depict something noble. Roman ruins, perfect green trees, mythological figures. Pissarro, on the other hand, shows a banal plowing scene, some peasant who isn't even properly painted, and dead mud. It's a painting about mud, and secondly, about blue mud. What kind of nonsense is that?
Could there be anything more base?
That's all the public saw. Here's what Louis Leroy said about this painting in that very critical article. In it, supposedly, two people come to the exhibition and discuss it. At the sight of this magnificent landscape, he thought his glasses had fogged up, and after carefully wiping the lenses, he put them back on his nose. "In the name of Miquelon," he exclaimed, "what on earth is this? You can see it just as well as I can. It's white frost on the deeply furrowed grooves of the earth."
Are these furrows? Is this frost?
These are just some shapeless scrapes on a dirty canvas. Where is the beginning and the end? Where is the top and the bottom? Where is the back and the front? And the front? Maybe. But there is an impression here. But pay attention to the technical handling of tone. Morning sunlight breaks through the bands of frost. Long bluish shadows from the trees cross the loose, rough surface. Pissarro doesn't invent a pretty picture. He captures the physical state of the atmosphere at a specific winter hour and paints the landscape in real, living colors. In 1873, a severe stock market crisis began in France and Europe as a consequence of the Franco-Prussian War. Durand-Ruel found himself on the verge of bankruptcy and in 1874 completely stopped purchasing Impressionist paintings. The only more or less stable source of income disappeared, leaving Pissarro with his family to support.
In order to get at least some money, in March 1875, Pissarro, together with Manet, Renoir and Berthe Morisot, organized a public auction at the Hôtel Drouot auction house. It was a catastrophic failure. The public came to the auction specifically to mock the paintings, and the prices dropped to a depressing minimum.
Pissarro's works were sold at a huge discount, averaging from 50 to 150 francs, barely covering the cost of the frame.
With 150 francs at that time, one person could live very modestly, but not a family.
During this period, Pissarro was saved by rare, occasional purchases from private collectors. In 1875, at the age of 45, Pissarro was in extreme need.
He already had 3 children, one daughter had died, and his wife Julie regularly wrote him desperate letters from Pontoise, demanding that he find at least a couple of francs for bread, the grocer, and firewood.
His paintings barely sold, and the money was nowhere near enough to live on. So Pissarro had to keep borrowing from friends, especially from Edouard Manet and Caillebotte.
He even started thinking about looking for a simple side job.
At this time, he paints his famous self-portrait. We see an elderly, balding man with a thick, graying beard like a biblical patriarch looking at us.
A little tired, but still determined.
Just imagine, the man has already worked in painting for 20 years. He has 3 children, his daughter has died, his wife nags him, his paintings aren't selling, and the future is uncertain.
But Pissarro continues to take his box of paints every day and go out to the hills of Pontoise.
At the beginning of the 1880s, the united front of the Impressionists begins to fall apart at the seams.
5 of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions have already occurred, and all have failed. The artists are growing divided over painting and their relationship with the official salon. Many artists such as Renoir and Monet are trying to get into it, while others, like Pissarro, are categorically opposed.
New artists with new techniques are emerging, competing with Impressionism, and now, in turn, the Impressionists themselves do not accept them.
The only person who categorically refuses to betray the idea of an independent association is Pissarro.
As a result, he will become the only artist in history to have participated in all 8 independent Impressionist exhibitions.
Camille tries to keep the group from falling apart and invites new blood to the exhibitions. First Paul Gauguin, and then Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. Because of this, Monet and Degas become terribly angry, scandals erupt, but Pissarro is convinced that art has no right to stagnate.
But why him in particular?
Here, our knowledge of Pissarro's childhood comes in handy. Pissarro was a committed ideological anarchist. He read the works of Pyotr Kropotkin and Élisée Reclus, who dreamed of the fall of the monarchy, the collapse of the bourgeois system, and the creation of a society of free workers. In other words, having observed from childhood how 2 ideologies conflicted, remember how his parents pretended to be Catholics and how people were hypocritical, he rejected all ideologies altogether. Pissarro never directly promoted his political views through his art. He didn't paint barricades, strikes, or bloody reprisals.
His anarchism in painting manifested itself in 2 things. First of all, a rejection of bourgeois tastes. He fundamentally refused to please the wealthy public, whom he considered steeped in vulgarity. And secondly, in his depiction of peasant labor.
The subjects of his paintings are not refined socialites, but simple village girls, apple pickers, and mowers. At the same time, Pissarro paints them with great human dignity, without false sweetness or pity. And it was precisely because of his anarchism and rejection of any ideology that it was much easier for him to accept everything new that came into view. And soon he would even venture down a dead-end, but extremely interesting path that became a notable trend in art.
By the early 1880s, Durand-Ruel had fully recovered from the stock market crisis of 1873.
The public resisted, but the dealer convinced one client after another, year after year, and built up a solid client base.
His position became so strong that Durand-Ruel signed a contract with Pissarro, under which he began to pay him a regular advance of 500 francs in exchange for the exclusive right to purchase his new paintings.
This provided the Pissarro family with a stable basic income. Dear Mr. Durand-Ruel, I urgently need 150 francs by the end of the week to pay a bill.
I will bring you 3 new canvases on Tuesday. This is a typical excerpt from their daily letters of the 1880s. And also in 1883, Durand-Ruel organized the first major solo exhibition of Pissarro in Paris. 50 paintings. Although the press reaction was lukewarm, this nevertheless moved the artist from the status of a scandalous rebel to the status of an almost recognized master. The decisive breakthrough in sales happened thanks to Durand-Ruel entering the American market. In Europe, the bourgeoisie was still wary of Impressionism, but in the United States, wealthy industrialists were looking for new, fresh European art. Everything that came from Europe was considered very prestigious, and the American bourgeoisie had plenty of money and gladly bought European art. In 1885 and 1886, Durand-Ruel took a huge collection of Impressionist works to New York and opened his own gallery there. And for Americans, Pissarro was a revelation. His bright and sunny landscapes and Pontoise views were bought up much more actively than in conservative Paris. By 1885, the paintings of the already 55-year-old Pissarro, imagine spending almost your whole life in poverty for the sake of a dream. Even in Europe, they were no longer being sold for the humiliating 50 francs, like at the 1875 auction, but for 500 to 1,500 francs per canvas. That was still very little compared to the fees of recognized academicians, which reached up to 100,000 francs. But this allowed Camille to finally rent a spacious house in Eragny-sur-Epte, which he was later able to buy outright and breathe a sigh of relief after 3 decades of poverty. But let's go back a bit to the moment when Pissarro was introduced to the 26-year-old artist Georges Seurat, who developed a new scientific painting technique. Pointillism, or divisionism, was based precisely on that very color wheel I told you about earlier. Seurat suggested abandoning the broad Impressionist brushstroke. Instead, he covered the entire canvas with small, strictly separated dots of pure colors. The master did not mix paints either on the palette or on the canvas. It was assumed that when viewed from a distance, the human eye would perform the physical and optical mixing itself and produce a color of unprecedented brightness. Any master at Pissarro's age would have shrugged and called the young people dreamers. But Pissarro was inspired by the idea, and for several years became deeply involved in Pointillism. While preparing for the last 8th Impressionist exhibition, which was already proceeding with great difficulty, Pissarro publicly challenged his comrades. Despite strong protests from Manet, Renoir and Degas, Camille insisted that the paintings of Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, as well as his own works in the new Pointillist technique, be exhibited in a separate room. Manet and Renoir were furious and outraged that the patriarch of the group had betrayed their common style for the sake of experimenting with young 25-year-old newcomers. Durand-Ruel was horrified. He had just accustomed buyers to the classic Impressionism of Pissarro, and now Pissarro had literally declared this style outdated and started bringing in paintings covered with dry colored dots, which even the most devoted collectors refused to buy. The appearance of Seurat's famous painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, alongside the new pointillist landscapes by the 56-year-old Pissarro, became the main public sensation and scandal of the last Impressionist exhibition. However, no one wanted to buy Pissarro's pointillist paintings, not even Durand-Ruel. In 2022, Georges Seurat's monumental painting, The Models, a small version painted in 1888, was sold for an astonishing $149 million. Pointillism did not continue to develop due to reasons I will explain below, but it became a significant milestone in the search for new forms and approaches to painting, something that almost only Pissarro was able to recognize at first glance. But he immediately faced backlash. At that time, Pissarro's pointillist paintings became a dead end. No one was buying them. His family once again quickly fell into desperate poverty. Pissarro writes to Lucien in 1887, "For years of hard work, you build a name for yourself. You work like 4 men, and it's all in vain. When it's time to pay, the bourgeois turn away. You have to humble yourself, beg them to buy some miserable painting out of pity. You want to give it all up." And just to somehow feed his 3 children and wife, the 57-year-old artist starts painting fans with gouache for the petty bourgeois at night. Let's review the works from this challenging time. First, let's look at Peasant Woman from 1876. An ordinary village girl in a pink scarf stands against a background of greenery. She has lowered her gaze and is lost in her thoughts. There is no artistic sophistication in this portrait. Pissarro shows that an uneducated woman from the provinces is also capable of feeling and thinking, just like a lady from high society.
Pay attention to the technique, to the brush strokes. They are still Impressionist.
And now let's compare it with a painting done in the Pointillist technique, apple picking at Eragny from 1888. Up close, this canvas really looks like it's shimmering. But if you take a few steps back, the dotted brush strokes of pure colors come together into a precise, well-ordered system, bathed in pure color. You see how he applies small elongated brush strokes of different colors side by side. Creating such a painting is a titanic effort. Each color must be in its proper place, and the proportions of the colors change the overall shade. That's why you have to be very careful not to overdo any one color. You see, in that one area representing the shadow, almost all the colors are gathered, and changing their proportions changes the color and creates smooth transitions. It took the artist anywhere from several months to half a year to create a single painting like this. In that time, he could have created 100 paintings in the Impressionist style. Besides, the dots didn't offer as much freedom as brushstrokes. It's as if they steal the sense of movement and air, turning into a very curious, painstaking, but extremely limited experiment in every sense. Pissarro truly devoted 4 years to Pointillism. 4 years of poverty, arguments with colleagues, and hard, painstaking work. But by 1889, he began to feel constrained by the rigid boundaries of the method. The Pointillist technique demanded so much time and precision that Pissarro lost spontaneity, the liveliness of momentary impressions, and the dynamic quality of nature and colors. In 1990, Pissarro wrote to his friend, the architect Henri de Van Velde, "I abandoned this theory, fortunately, in time. I came to the conclusion that I couldn't convey my feelings with it, that I couldn't capture movement, the fleeting and marvelous changes of nature. Obviously, I wasn't made for that kind of art. It gives me the impression of an all-leveling, all-equalizing indifference of death." And Pissarro takes a brave step. He admits that Seurat's method doesn't suit him. He abandons the dots and returns to a free Impressionist style. Not everyone among us is able to admit their mistakes. Not everyone is ready to write off 4 years of their life and say, "I was wrong." But, as we now know, he was not wrong. Pointillism has secured a lasting place in the pantheon of art, and Pissarro became one of the few who had something to do with it. And even those 4 years were not wasted. Pissarro's brushstroke becomes finer and even cleaner. It's as if he learned to break the brushstroke into its components. This will become an important feature of Pissarro's unique style. Pay attention to his later paintings. For some time, and even later on, he will use the same mixing of different spots of paint right on the canvas. Only the dots will turn into brush strokes, and this creates a magnificent, vibrant sense of movement. Honestly, I like this post-Pointillist period of his the most. The return to Impressionism in 1890 not only brought Pissarro his clients back, but also gave him the long-awaited financial triumph and worldwide status. The public of that time really loved stories about sudden comebacks, and the news that the patriarch of Impressionism, who had once abandoned it and gone astray, had returned again, paradoxically played into the legend surrounding him. As soon as Pissarro abandoned the Pointillist method and returned to a free, rich brushstroke, Paul Durand-Ruel immediately resumed his purchases. The dealer readily took all his new canvases and once again began to regularly pay advances. Only now it was up to 20,000 francs a year. In February 1892, Durand-Ruel organized a large solo exhibition for Pissarro in Paris, 50 paintings and 20 gouaches. The exhibition was a tremendous success with critics, collectors, and the public. The paintings were sold right from the gallery at record prices for him, ranging from 1,500 to 3,500 francs per canvas. It was the money from the sales of free Impressionist landscapes after 1890 that allowed Pissarro to do what he had dreamed of for decades. In 1892, he bought the house and land in Eragny-sur-Epte from the owners, paying off all the family debts. And then one misfortune happened, which, by a lucky coincidence, also became his lucky break. Sorry for the tautology. By the early 1890s, Pissarro faced a serious eye disease. The festering of the tear duct prevented the 60-year-old artist from working outdoors. Any cold wind, dust, or bright sunlight caused severe pain and inflammation. Doctors forbade him from painting outdoors. Can you imagine what it's like for an artist whose whole life consists of endless plein air sessions? What should he do? Should he really give up painting just when success has finally come to him? Of course, you understand that someone like Pissarro could never do that. So he comes up with a clever solution and decides to simply rise above the dust. Pissarro starts making almost daily trips to different cities and renting rooms on the upper floors of hotels in Paris, Rouen, Dieppe, and Le Havre. He opens a window and paints the city from a bird's eye view. From this time, his famous period of cityscapes begins. These series, especially the Parisian boulevards, were bought up by French, American, and European collectors even before the paint had time to dry on them. By the end of the 1890s, Pissarro had transformed from a perpetual debtor into a wealthy and internationally recognized patriarch of Impressionism. You must admit, it's impossible to fully understand an artist and his work without knowing details of his life. That's why I always tell you about painting through the eyes of the artist, sometimes inflamed, but still seeing. Subscribe, this is just the beginning. The rural backwater is left in the past. Pissarro discovers the poetry of a vast, bustling industrial metropolis. The concept of walking in series was already present then. Claude Monet had already painted his famous Haystacks and Rouen Cathedral, trying to show how the colors and hues differ on exactly the same subjects, painted at different times of the year or in different weather. I think it was Monet's color series that finally showed the public of that time the differences in how objects look in reality under different lighting conditions. When we look at the haystacks and the cathedral, we immediately see both the weather and the season. But we also understand that both the pink haystack and the blue cathedral are actually sand-colored. Our brain makes this conclusion automatically when we see things in real life. The Impressionists were the first to capture this effect and transfer it to the canvas. And Pissarro adopts this method as well. Let's take a look at his famous Boulevard Montmartre series, painted in 1897 from the window of the Grand Hotel de Russie. Pissarro painted this boulevard 13 times. First, let's look at Boulevard Montmartre from the Hermitage collection. The wide artery of the street recedes deep into the canvas. Multi-story buildings, carriages, and tiny figures of passers-by come into view. Notice that the figures are not painted in detail. These are quick, precise brushstrokes and spots that convey the pulse and bustle of a crowded city. And now let's compare this work with the same spot but at a completely different time of day. Boulevard Montmartre at night. Do you feel how the space transforms just with the use of color? The heavy silhouettes of the buildings blend with the dark sky, but look at how the wet asphalt lights up. Electric and gas lanterns are reflected in the puddles with bright yellow, white, and orange highlights. And we can unmistakably recognize the same scene, just at a different time of day. Despite the great fame that finally came to him at the end of his life, in his 60s, Pissarro remained the same humble hard worker for whom the work of his life was more important than bank accounts. From his letter to his son Lucien. Painting, art in general, fascinates me. This is my life, that's all. I don't care about anything else. When you put your whole soul and all the nobility you have into something, you will always find someone close who will understand you. In the autumn of 1903, Pissarro, despite his advanced age and increasing frailty, continued to work actively. He had just returned to Paris from Le Havre, where he painted another series of seascapes and harbor views. In the first days of November, Pissarro fell seriously ill. He developed a severe prostate abscess. Due to the infection, his temperature rose sharply. The doctor who was called in to see the artist insisted on urgent surgery to open the abscess. The operation was performed right at home, but the artist's weakened body could not cope with the consequences. Blood poisoning began, and the strain on his heart proved fatal. The farewell to the patriarch of Impressionism was modest, without lavish state honors, which he himself had always refused during his lifetime because of his anarchist convictions and deeply modest outlook. Pissarro was buried in the famous Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, section 23, in the family crypt. All the surviving comrades of the art revolution came to his funeral. Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, Paul Signac, as well as numerous young artists for whom he had always remained the main father figure and mentor. Pissarro wasn't a bold innovator like Monet, nor did he have Monet's social brilliance, but without his character, Impressionism would have collapsed from internal conflicts and not survived to gain recognition, even with Durand-Ruel's help. Without him, there would not have been the two giants of post-Impressionism, Paul Cézanne and Paul Gauguin, who considered him their teacher. He was the only one who participated in all 8 independent Impressionist exhibitions. He was the only one who wasn't afraid at the age of 55 to start all over again with Pointillism and then go back. And he was the only one who, until his last day, believed that the most important thing in life is not money or critics' opinions, but the honor of painting what you truly see. Whether it's the sunny shores of the Caribbean Sea or a gentle pastoral scene in a Paris suburb. Friends, I created this channel to tell you about art in a simple and engaging way. I love doing this. And every new video is my little project where I need to create an interesting narrative, select up to 500 photos sometimes, arrange them correctly, and add captions.
It's a huge amount of work, but quality is more important to me than quantity.
I'll keep doing this, but your support would be really helpful to me. Please become a sponsor of the channel here on YouTube, or sign up for even the smallest subscription on Boosty or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. Let's create the most knowledgeable art community in the world. And thank you for watching.